So, Jai Bhim and Namo Buddhaya to you all. Today we will be commencing our course on Baba Sahib Ambedkar economics. Basically, this word Ambedkar economics, as somebody said in the group, is very sweet and it conveys what is this all about. So let me begin by way of introduction. That today we will be looking at the first part of what is called the aspect of the Ambedkar economics. And the topic today will be economic history of India. And it's going to be a very interesting journey into the thoughts and concepts that are enunciated by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So, in the coming 6 weeks, we'll be looking at various aspects of Baba Sahib's economics, particularly in terms of economic history of India. Then we will be looking at the public finance or the aspects of political economy in the second session. In the third, we will be looking at a very interesting field of economics called monetary economics, which deals with money. And then in the fourth session, we're looking at the development economics with reference to what Baba Ambedkar has contributed and his understanding and his sort of foray into the welfare state. And in the fifth, we will be looking at the constitutional law and economics, of course, from the point of view of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. And in the last, we'll be looking at the Buddhist economics. So whenever we think about Baba Sahib Ambedkar, we think about him in terms of the great uh, leader and the great sociologist, the great legal expert. But though he had very astonishing background and knowledge of economics, we hardly hear about Baba Sahib Ambedkar as an economist. And I thought that by the way of this course, we'll be opening up a lot of ideas that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has brought into his writings. And I think that would give a lot of fuel to our thinking about Baba Sahib Ambedkar. And, with that goal in mind, I have conceived this kind of 6 sessions on Baba Sahib's economics. So let me enter into the topics directly. I thought before I go into the presentation further, I will show you something very interesting to start off with as to when we look at Baba Sahib Ambedkar having had 2 degrees, PhD degrees, research degrees in economics from the topmost universities of the time. So I thought that by the way of sharing with you something, I will just put before you this very interesting sort of Baba Sahib's foray uh, into economics. So he studied economics, MA and PhD in Columbia University, and you can look at Baba Sahib's courses that he has taken in less than 3 years of time. He has studied so much. So I'm just going to pinpoint to you some of the courses that he has taken up in the Columbia. Of course, money and banking in the beginning of his foray, start of career in Columbia University. He studied money and banking, corporation, finance, of course, principles of sociology. We are not concerned with that today. Science of finance, economics 101, 102. And here you can see what he has studied also. And then the economic problems of Germany, then economic readings, classical English economist, then principles and methods of statistics, social statistics, history of economics since Adam Smith. You see, all these very interesting sort of the courses that Baba Ambedkar took in Columbia University. Social statistic, economic theory, the trust and corporation problem, Marx and post-Marxian socialism. You see, commerce and commercial policy, seminar in political economy and finance, and value and distribution. You see why I'm showing this to you? Because the content of the course is so encyclopedic that we find all that encyclopedic knowledge reflected in what Baba Sahib Ambedkar has written in terms of his economic thinking. So, just to give you an idea as to how deeply, how thoroughly, how broadly he was studied in economics. And just this, the course material will show us how broadly he has studied economics. For our concern, this Economics 119 economic history is of a great importance, because today I'm going to begin with that, and it will make us understand the kind of the knowledge that Dr. Baba Ambedkar was producing in terms of economics. And of course, statistical economics, if you pick up any of his book at random, particularly in economics, you will find it's full of data. Now, there is so much of a data he collected so meticulously that you will find that his all books on economics are filled with the statistical data, statistical analysis, what we term today as the data analysis. And I think with this, you can see the extent of his, understanding of economics. So I just wanted to, at the beginning, give you a kind of, a flash of, his studies of this great discipline of economics. So let me go back to my presentation, and let's begin now with Baba Sahib Ambedkar's Economic History of India. So you see, we do not have any book which is titled as Baba Sahib Ambedkar's Economic History of India. But as I will show you, he was, of course, writing about the economic history of India. And you can imagine it takes a lot of, 2,500 years of span of time to think through about the economic history of India. And we can see that in Baba Sahib's, writings as to how he has written the economic history of India. He has talked about the economy in the ancient India, medieval India, India before the EIC, that is East India Company, India during the East India Company, and what happened when the power was transferred from the company to the crown. That is from the company, East India Company, to the British Parliament in 1858. And we are going to look at that briefly because it's a very vast topic, and I'm just going to give you some pointers so that you can look for yourself. You can study for yourself. How Baba Ambedkar conceived his encyclopedic project of writing the economic history of India. So before we get into that, we know Baba Ambedkar. I would call him an engaged economist, because he was not just a researcher into the vast domain of the different disciplines that were emerging in the field of economics, but he was also a practitioner. His contribution, his thinking has affected the Indian economy a lot. And I think that makes him something very special, somebody who is very special in terms of not only somebody who is producing the knowledge, but also applying it in order to better the lives of the millions and millions of people. So I would in the beginning term him as an engaged economist. He's not just an armchair economist. He had developed a lot of beautiful ideas, as we are going to see in the course of the 6 weeks. But also, he has made those ideas into a kind of the tools to transform the lives of the millions and millions of people. So you see, Baba Ambedkar had 2 PhD degrees economics from the topmost universities in the world, Columbia University and London School of Economics. That was the time when economics as a discipline was in the formative stages of theoretical developments. Dr. Baba Ambedkar's research areas encompassed vast fields and interdisciplinary studies. He practiced economics for the development of India and common people. His contribution is huge. His contribution in terms of the economic development of India is huge, which is not often talked about. And we're going to look into that. He was a pioneer in several fields in Indian economy, like I talked about the monetary economics. I briefly referred to the development economics. I briefly referred to the how to share the revenue between the center and the state. And he was, he started, of course, in his college, Siddharth College, and in college, the economics was taught. So he was sort of somebody who pioneered, the study of economics. So before, I launch my inquiry into the actual content, I thought that, we should look at some kind of a personal guidance to Baba Sahib Ambedkar as the great economist. And, there is, of course, a lot of people, talk about, not loving money, renunciating the world, and so on and so forth. So that was an argument which was put forth by Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, whom Baba Saheb Ambedkar admired so much that in the end of his life, Baba Saheb Ambedkar wanted to study the entire writings of Bertrand Russell. That was passion of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, to go deeply into the world of ideas and the thoughts. So Bertrand Russell has written a very interesting book during the war called The Principles of Social Reconstruction, a very beautiful book. And Baba Saheb Ambedkar has written a kind of a review of that book. And, it's a very interesting review. But for us, it's very interesting to look into, should we love money, and what Baba Saheb Ambedkar is going to guide us about the love for money. So Bertrand Russell, of course, said the love of money leads men and women to mutilate their own nature from a mistaken theory of what constitutes success, and to give admiration to enterprises which add nothing to human welfare. It promotes a dead uniformity of character and purpose, a diminution in the joy of life, and a trace and strain which leaves whole communities weary, discouraged, and disillusioned. That is what Bertrand Russell said. And Baba Saheb Ambedkar has criticized this view. And he said that, thinking that we don't need to love money, Baba Saheb Ambedkar said that that is an ancient thinking which served as the basic philosophy. We served as a basic philosophy of life in the past. And Baba Saheb Ambedkar talks about, the society in the antiquity and the modern society. And he says that, we cannot think in terms of the past. As his teacher John Dee would say, that the golden age lives in the future, not in the past. We are always trying to live in the past, saying that the past was more advanced, more beautiful than the present, but such is not the case. So Baba says that that was that ancient thinking which served as a basic philosophy of life in the past. The economic life and philosophic outlook of a society are more intimately connected, and the economic interpretation, of course, that's a Marxian phrase to interpret history in terms of economics, hold true. Baba Saheb said holds true if chipped off its exaggeration. So this point will be clear when we look at the next slide. And I purposely brought this up here to begin with. Baba Ambedkar talks about pain economy and pleasure economy. So economy in the past was a pain economy, because like a lot of people were living in the poverty, and in the past world was living in poverty, low productivity. So the gospel of poverty was taught. You look at any religion, it taught the gospel of poverty. You look at Christianity, it taught the gospel of poverty. It doesn't encourage the accumulation of the riches. And so you see, this is the philosophy of sour grapes, of the have-nots, is the most human of all beliefs. And he talks very beautifully about the philosophy of the haves and the philosophy of the have-nots, as to how they try to push forward their ideas. In other words, what Baba Ambedkar is trying to say, that when we cannot have a thing, we argue that it is not worth having. That was the situation in the past, because that was a pain economy. And the belief of pain economy is that a thing must be bad if it cannot be had. Because as we know that in the ancient world, the poverty was rampant. If we see the life expectancy, people used to die very early, and the incidences of diseases and so on and so forth. So you see, that was a pain economy. And the belief of the pain economy is that a thing must be bad if it cannot be had. And the belief of pleasure economy, which talks about the consumption, like the modern economy, where we have so many choices, so much of abundance of the things that we can consume. Look at the developments in the agriculture. There was the dearth of food, so many famines took place where millions died. The plague killed so many people in the past. But today we are in the realm of what Baba Saheb Ambedkar termed as a pleasure economy, is that a thing is bad if it can be cheaply had. You see, so the value of the things started decreasing. You see, imagine the past, because of the scarcity, because there were low productivity and squalor and poverty, people didn't have access to much. But today, we are living the life of a plenty. Yet, we think that the thing is bad if it can be cheaply had. So, Baba Saheb Ambedkar makes a very interesting point to begin with, and it's a lesson for all of us that we should love money. And why? How we should love money? He says, in the healthy mind, there is no such thing as a love for money in abstract. Because we cannot say that I love money in abstract. Love for money is always for something. isn't it? Because we want to have something. So money is a medium to get something, and money is always for something, and it is the purpose embodied in that for something. Now look at Baba Sahib Ambedkar. He has seen the worst kind of poverty that a person can imagine. But if you look at the way he lived, he lived the life of abundance, isn't it? His mentality was not poverty mentality, as it is called, the mentality of poverty. His mentality was that of the abundance. You look at his dresses, his books, his the way he carried himself, and his collection of the artworks, invaluable books, music, records, and we begin to see that he had this, he cultivated himself so beautifully. So he is an example for us whether we should strive to earn money or not to earn money. I think this is a great lesson for us today, that we have to have this mentality of abundance, the mentality that Dr. Baba Ambedkar himself practiced. And one of the reasons that he converted to Buddhism, that is cited, is because the Buddha never ennobled poverty. The other religions might have ennobled poverty. Oh, poverty is good. It's good to be poor. It's good to have a minimum things. But Baba Ambedkar had this very rich mentality. Though he was not a materialistic person in a sense, he had this renunciation built in him. If you look at his house, Rajagriha, that he built, in the end, he gave that house for the people. House, so he gave the house for the people. If we see that, he converted Rajagriha into the hostel for the scheduled caste boys, and he lived in a flat in Bombay. So that is the approach that we need to have towards money. We need to love money, not for the sake of loving money, but for the sake of what it can do. Money can do a lot, and that's the message I wanted to just put this in front of you, to make you aware of a kind of a mentality that Baba Sahib Ambedkar had, the mentality of abundance, the mentality of richness, the mentality of uh, not poverty, because the mentality of poverty leads to a lot of suffering. So let's enter into the topic, economic history of India. And it was Baba Sahib Ambedkar's ambitious thesis for MA. So for PhD, he wrote another thesis, but as a fulfillment of degree of MA, that time, in the Columbia University, you have to write a dissertation. And Baba Ambedkar, as I can now construct, he was working on an encyclopedic MA thesis on economic history of India. But in the end, he ended up submitting administration and finance of the East India Company. Very beautiful document to read, very interesting study to be undertaken. But let's look at it. We have his manuscript, which was titled in the BOS, Baba Ambedkar's Writing and Speeches, as Ancient Indian Commerce. But that was not a title. That was put by the editors. And it's more than just Ancient Indian Commerce. If you look at it in the volume 12, these are the chapters there. So the first chapter is Commercial Relations of India in the Middle East. Second chapter was Commercial Relations of India in the Middle Ages. Chapter 3, India on the eve of the Crown Government. Now, these chapters were numbered by the editors afterwards. Like Vasan Mun Sahab has done it. And, there is a vast body of writing available. Some of the, pages are eaten by the termites. But whatever is available, it's so fascinating. It shows the thinking of young Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So how deeply he was thinking about these broader areas of commercial relations of India. And I'm going to show you how deeply he was thinking about it and what we can learn from it. So in the end, Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar didn't submit the encyclopedic economic history of India, but whatever he submitted as a fulfillment of his MA degree, which is available to us, administration and finance of the East India Company, it's very interesting document. But without this perspective, without this background of the notes that are available, as enumerated here as chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, it doesn't make much sense. We can study it independently, of course, but if we study it through this earlier writings, we find it very fascinating. So, reconstructed sequence of the economic history of India. So from ancient India to British Raj, you see how broad his inquiry into the foray of. Okay, so what I'm going to look at, the 3 chapters mentioned above were numbered as 1, 2, and 5. In the original scheme, the chapter 1, 2, 3, as we have seen in the previous slide, were numbered as 1, 2, and 5. The two chapters are missing, chapter 3 and 4, according to the editors, but I don't think so. Where are the chapters? The chapter 3 and chapter 4 became the thesis submitted for the fulfillment of the MA degree. The final product would have following content: the the economy of ancient India, the economy of medieval India, economy before the East India Company, economy during EIC, economy during the Crown government. And these all itself are the vast topic of inquiry. And I encourage all the youngsters to kindly go through this beautiful text. If you are preparing for any competitive exams, it will give you so much of a knowledge that you cannot imagine the profundity of the knowledge that you are going to have if you look into these writings of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So, Survey of Economic Development of Ancient India. According to Baba Sahib Ambedkar and the history as it attesting today, Indian subcontinent was a source of riches and knowledge. There is no doubt about that. Starting from the Indus Valley civilization, all the riverine civilizations in China, Yangtze River, in Egypt, Nile River, and this in the Iraq, these four great riverine civilization, as we know today, they had in the prehistoric time they had the trade together. That's how we came to know the name of the Indus Valley civilization. It was called Melua. And in the inscriptions of the Sumerians, this word Melua was found. And now we can conclusively prove that in the ancient time, the Asiatic, most of them, all of them were Asiatic civilizations. We don't know much about the Maya civilization in the Latin America and so on and so forth. But these four riverine civilizations were like at the top of the world. That time Europe was nowhere. So the Indian subcontinent, who is doing this? So the Survey of Economic Development of Ancient India, Indian subcontinent was a source of riches and knowledge. India did not produce any literature on the science of economic as such. That's what Baba Ambedkar says, that in China, they produce the science of economic. In other cultures, they produce the science of economic. But and I think this slide is very important for us to understand the economic history of the ancient India. According to Baba Ambedkar, that time when he is studying in the Colombian student, his comment is very, important. He says the Brahminical literature is sacerdotal, which means it's related to the sacred things, so-called sacred things. As a class, the Brahmins were drones in the hive, gorging at the feast to which they contributed nothing, and enjoyed conspicuous leisure and the conspicuous consumption. So he says that, that was a literati at that time. He says that the Brahmins were literati at that time. But he's talking about the, Aryan society. There was a vast society, Dravidian society. There was a vast society, the Naga society, which gives a lot of references in this survey of the economy in the ancient times. So what Baba Ambedkar says, so we have to rely on foreign authorities and their scanty reference to India's commerce. That's young Baba Ambedkar in the Colombian University, remarking like that. And he's saying there is no authority that can take us back to the pre-Buddha times. And if you study that, you will find, he says the great teacher Buddha. That's young Baba Ambedkar studying economics, and he is calling at one point of time in his notes the great teacher, the Buddha. He was already taken by the Buddha. So he says, and this is very interesting, there is no authority that can take us back to the pre-Buddha times. The Buddha Jatakas, the birth stories of the Buddha, are the earliest source on the subject and contain literary references to the economic organization of the Indian society. That's Baba Sahib, 20 in the early 20s. We cannot imagine such a genius. In the early 20s, writing deeply, studying deeply about things that matters to him. And you see, if you begin to see this, he has studied the Jataka tales because that is the only authenticate source to study the ancient India. The so-called Brahminical text offer nothing as a way of history. And the Buddha's Jataka comes to the help to explain the ancient India. And this is what he says. Economic organization of the ancient Indian society was like this. It was agriculture-based society, agrarian society, and the social gradation, he says, was like this, that the agriculture of the farmers were at the top, the merchants were at the bottom, and the next level, they were soldiers. And he says that a great deal of cooperation among the villagers for public work. Cow worship was economics. It was not related to the so-called religion. It was related to economics. And he shows in that book how it was related to economic. And he says in the ancient India, how the labor was organized, how the industry and commerce was organized. He says slavery played a very little role in their economic life. He says that in the ancient India, there was no slavery. He said free labor paid, free labor paid in money or food. And of course, referring to the Buddhist Jatakas, he says that the industrial classes, very interesting. Vaddhaki means one who will work with the wood. They will craft the wooden material, including the ship. The shipbuilding was included in the Vaddaki. Today we say Vadai or whatever. Vaddaki profession. Kammakar, those who engaged in production of the things. And of course, Pasana Kottaka, one who worked with the stone. So these were all industrial classes at the time of the in the ancient society, and they are all referred in the Buddhist Jataka. So he uses the Buddhist Jataka to glean into the history of the ancient India, and that's itself is a big step, isn't it? Numerous trade guilds. He says that there were trade guilds like leather workers guild was there, the goldsmiths, and ironsmiths, and so on and so forth. And the tendency was towards hereditary occupation. This is very interesting. He says that the tendency was towards hereditary occupation, but the caste system in its hideous rigorousness was not present. Brahmins were occupied in low professions. That's what he says. And he of course gives the reference of the Buddhist Jatakas. And he says that external and internal commerce was so important that the Buddha Jataka mentions caravan leaders. Big caravan, large caravan, carrying, the cartload of the commodities from one place to another throughout Indian subcontinent, outside Indian subcontinent, east, west, all over the places, the external and internal commerce was so important. And Baba Ambedkar further talks about the economy in the ancient India. Trade was not entirely individualistic. Corporate commercial activities and partnership in trades were occasional. Little government control of business and was limited to royal purchase. Duty on both native merchandise and overseas consignment with one sample. So you see, if there is anything imported to India, the king was to be given one sample, isn't it? That was a practice. And later on, the prices were fixed by the king. In a month, for a few days, he will fix the price of the commodities. Money was used, and the barter system was replaced by the metal currency. At the time of the Buddha, there was no barter system. There was a metal currency. Banking was not developed, and there was no taboo on loans and interest. Very interesting. If you think about every single point, they are so important when we study economics. So important, every single point. International trade due to monsoon winds. The monsoon winds was discovered. Baba Ambedkar gives the name of a person who discovered the monsoonal this thing, and the international trade due to the monsoon wind. And commerce with other countries in the ancient civilization. Culture in all times follows the wake of commerce. As we know that, as the Chinese says, that India colonized China through Buddhism, isn't it? And we know that trade was taking place. And as Baba Ambedkar says, culture in all times follows the wake of commerce. With Egypt and China, that time there was... Chandrakant, will you stop playing with these things? So with Egypt and China, there was... 1 minute. So you see, this is, there was a trade taking place with Egypt and China, and seafaring became the habit with the Indians. Indians were so familiar with the techniques and the mechanism of seafaring that in the Kevadda Sutta, the Buddha talks about how the international trade was taking place. And the scholar says that, Buddha can talk about like that because that was the common knowledge in India at that time as to how the seafaring was being done. And this is very fascinating, the Dravidian and Greek trade. You see, there is Baba Ambedkar goes into the depth of it, showing how the Dravidians had the trade with the Greek. And if you look at the Indian geography, the peninsula was the most important part. If you want to conduct an intellectual exercise, you just reverse the map. and make north south and south north, because we are habituated to see the land at the top. But if you turn the map upside down, you begin to see that the Indian peninsula was very, very prominent place in the history of the ancient times. And that was a place where a lot of trade and commerce was taking. That is the place where Christianity appeared first time, where the Islam appeared first time in India. So you see, the Indian peninsula is very important, and we find the reference of the Dravidian languages in the Greek language, and so on and so forth. Chinese sources, very interestingly, Baba Ambedkar has gone into Chinese sources and shown how India was at the helm of the trading circuit. And Baba Ambedkar says individual migration is a habit of civilized man. Ancient folks always moved in bands. So now we know how the ships were plying from India, from both the eastern coast and western coast to different parts of the India, carrying a lot of commodities. And this is interesting. Two land routes and two sea routes between Asia and Europe. Please keep this in mind, because when we study the economic history, this is very important that there were two routes, two land routes and two sea routes. And when we are going to see what happens to those routes in the medieval times. And in the history, the land routes were closed, and that's affected the interaction between Europe and India. And we see that's how it happened. So it is because of the rise of Islam. When Islam was rising in about 500 600 AD, and that was a time even the Christianity was consolidated, the papal power was consolidated, and the medieval commerce was affected deeply, as to how we are going to see. Because India was at the helm of the power, there was Europe, and India was at the top of the world at that time, and there was a lot of trade and commerce was taking place. And we lot of evidences now, archaeological evidences now. That time, at when Baba Ambedkar was writing this, there might not be many evidences, but today we have plentiful of the archaeological resources. So Asiatic nomads, like particularly we know the Mongols, the Genghis Khan, and the Kublai Khan, they won from Europe to Japan. The land they were victorious of was such a massive land. And they controlled the Central Asia, they controlled the parts of Europe, they controlled China, and they controlled the north of the Indian subcontinent. And there were crusades, wars between the Christians and the Muslims. And if Franks, or the people of French, had not defeated the Arabs in southern France, the Europe today would have been completely in the fold of Islam. And later on, we know that the Roman Empire, which was a very powerful empire, and Baba Ambedkar goes into the reasons as to why Roman Empire crumbled into decays. The Roman Empire crumbled in the medieval times. The commerce was on decline. Christianity was anything but an optimistic religion. That's what Baba Ambedkar says. It was a protest against the comfort of life. It ennobled the poverty, and economics was held down by religion. Christian doctrine of usury, very important, because the Christian religion banned the loans, and that's how the Judaism or Jews rose into power, prominence in the economic terms. They did a lot to the economic development, because in their religion they could charge the interest on the loans, but in Christianity it was considered to be the sin. And that doctrine affected a lot in terms of the economics. The conclusion of the religious war expanded Christian trade and assimilation of Oriental and Moorish civilization. You see, it is not that the world was statically divided or compartmentalized into east, west, north, south. The ideas were free flowing, people were meeting. It was a very dynamic world. It's not a static world that we think in our minds, but it was a very dynamic world. It's a lot of ideas, trade, commerce was taking place. And you see, that is the conclusion of the religious war, expanded Christian trade, and assimilation of Oriental and Moorish. Moorish means Islamic civilization. India before the advent of the British. And Baba Ambedkar says that India, before the British came to India, the East India came to India, East India Company came to India. India was very advanced. It was a hub of industries and, sound administration, even the currencies, the money was in place. And it was it was not, compared to even England, he says that India was very prosperous that time. And he talks about the Muslim rulers, and he says that some of them very enlightened rulers, they ruled with justice. They carried on the public work, and he gives the example of that. He of course says Marathas, they were doing very well, and he gives the testimony of the travelers of the time. Tipu Sultan in South, he was a great ruler according to Baba Sahib, did so much, and the Bengal was the Garden of Eden. The Muslim of Bengal was so much favored in Europe that time. People were just craving to buy the ladies in Europe, England. They were so much craving for buying the Muslim cloth from Bengal. And Baba Sahib Ambedkar, it was like the Garden of Eden. And that's what India was before the advent of the British. Now, what made the Europeans to find alternative routes to India? As I told you, the advent of Islam and the instability in the Central Asia and in the parts of Europe and Asia, the trade couldn't take place. So the European had to find alternative routes to India. So the Portuguese came, the Spaniards came to the eastern part of the world, the English came, French came, and Dutch came. And in a few paragraphs, Baba Ambedkar talks about how they fought with each other, where they lost, where they won. Very beautiful explanation. A very, 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 very beautiful writing. So in the 15th and 16th century, the Europeans used and appreciated the spices. They came for the spices. Why they needed spices? You see, it's a very micro, level study about very details. He goes into the details of the things, and that's one of the things that we need to learn from Baba Ambedkar, how we can go into the details. So why they needed spices? One answer is taste, because you cannot eat the bland food. The poor in the Europe needed spices because you cannot. The food is so scarce. You cannot throw the food even if it's stale. So you need to spice it up in order to make it palatable to your tongue. And spices are, of course, the best preservatives. And in the medieval Europe, the demand of the spices was high. And some of the records show that people made fortune. I think 10 or 15 times the investment of the ventures they carried to import food spices from India. They earned a lot. Vasco da Gama, all these people when they came to India carried spices. They earned the profit so much, many times than the investment. And why sea routes? Because the old overland route were blocked by the Turks and the Mongols. So they had to find a way to, by the way of sea, to come to India. And East India Company and the loot of India. Baba Ambedkar is very categorical, in terms of talking about the EIC, very categorical. And I'm going to show you the kind of data he uses. I couldn't include that in the presentation because it's an overwhelming data. And Baba Ambedkar does, as I told you, very deep research into data, and he finds out based on the evidences as to what has happened. So East India Company, EIC, and the loot of India, and Baba Ambedkar says that we cannot trust the British historians because of their tendencies of being the imperialistic. They were creating the empire. So they were, of course, defending their conquest of India. And they, nothing hold ground as such. But the British historians were, this is what Baba Ambedkar says. He gives evidences as to how they skewed the reality. So India was conquered between 1757 to 1818. From the Battle of Plassey to the Battle of Bhima Koregaon. Now, why I put this important dates? Because Baba Ambedkar had something very interesting to say about these two battles, the first battle and the last battle. But not here in this paper or book. In other words, when he says that what the British have done to the untouchables, he says that in the Battle of Plassey, it were the army of the untouchables, the Dusats, who won the battle for the British. And that was a common front. The Muslim ruler and the French, they got together against the British in the Battle of Plassey. And of course, most of us, we know the Battle of Bhima Koregaon. It's the last battle when, and what America says that, that time there was nothing like, people would fight with fight for anybody. This was a period of great turmoil in Europe. It was not an easy time in the Europe because that was a time when Napoleon was rising after the French Revolution in Europe. And his wars ended in 1815. So you see the 1757, the period of about 70 years. It took 70 years, more than that. The East India Company was formed in 1600. And it doesn't happen in at one stroke. It took a lot of time to, for the British to establish their sovereignty over India. It took a lot of time. And studying that time is very interesting. That's what Baba Ambedkar done. He has studied the time, and I'm going to show you how deeply he studied the time. This was a period of great turmoil in Europe. Napoleonic Wars ended with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. England was deeply involved in the war. So the British Parliament has nothing to do with conquest of India. It was the East India Company which won India for the British. And Baba Ambedkar says it was not even the British East India Company that won India for the British. He says India had rather conquered itself. You see, the money for the conquest came from India. The three-fourth of the army was of the Indians, and the French, devised a technology by, they created the disciplined army, and they created resources to train the native Indians, and the native Indians constituted three-fourth of the British army and the French army and all that. They cannot bring so much of an army from outside. Baba Ambedkar says that India cannot be said to be conquered by the foreigners. India had rather conquered herself. Very interesting point. With all, facts, analysis, and, very deep study. So let's look at the British imperialism. Why these points are important? Because they have a bearing on the economic history of India. And I'm going to show you how, that is there, the economic history of India. The British imperialism, rulers of India with the contemporary of Britain. So economic condition of people of India was better than that was under the East India Company. And Baba Ambedkar, gives the evidence of that. India became poor with the policies of the Parliament and the East India Company. So both the Parliament and the East India Company was responsible to make India poorer and poorer. And Adam Smith, considered to be the founder of the economics, and his book, The Wealth of Nation, I recommend everybody to read this book, Wealth of Nations. It is said that all the great Nobel Prize winners, some of them read this book every year. It's their habit to read this book. Like the biology, people who study biology read Darwin's, Origin of Species. Some of them, love it so much that and are very top class people. So the Wealth of Nation, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation, read by, top class people even now. And he criticized the EIC as more of despotic mercantile order than the sovereign rulers. He said that they only acted as the merchants. And this merchants, the development of the merchants and the mercantile class actually changed the history of England itself. And we can go into that, but that's not the time. Adam Smith shows how the emergence of the mercantile class in England has destroyed the aristocracy and the feudal structure, and how it led to the commodification. Very important term, commodification, because it's just a way of example. You see, the land could not be, was not up for the sale in the medieval time. Even in India, the land was owned by the kings, and the people used to work as a tenants on the land. So how did the land transfer from the possession of a few to the commodity has the roots of the history, development of economics. Likewise, the labor. That time labor was not bought and sold. If somebody worked on my farm, I'm going to give him whatever the produce of the farm. There was no system like, labor in terms of the, labor market. So even the labor was commodified. This is called the commercialization principle or commodification of land, of labor. And, this is how the modern economy began. So the parable of poor man's friend, the thinking that favored England and fatal to India, is a very interesting quote by Baba Ambedkar. He quotes Charles Dickens, where he says that the British wanted to pose themselves as the poor man's friend, as the Indians are perpetually lower classes. They cannot think for themselves. Only the British can do the thinking for themselves. And it's now on the record that England became more prosperous after 1600, and mercantile class became powerful in England. Before the advent of the East India Company. And, Baba Ambedkar shows it very with the numbers. I'm going to show you how, the Indians were impoverished. So let's go further. How India contributed to British wealth? Baba says trade. Trade means the stock exchange. And Baba Ambedkar has given how the stock of the East India Company rose and fell. And he says that that's how the market capitalization of the East India Company contributed so much to the British wealth, so much to the British wealth. Because the trade as the augmentation of wealth, stock quotation is a barometer of business condition, value of Indian trade in England. If we study the value of Indian trade, in England, we can see that the dividends paid to the British, the directors of the East India Company, the common people who were the members of the East India, invested in the stocks of East India Company, they benefited hugely, handsomely. And throughout the 18th century, the company's stock was always at a premium, always at the premium. It was never at the loss. The sum of the money paid to British during 1798 to 1803 is estimated to be, at that time, pounds 23, 3433, 215. I am not able to figure out how is that, but let me figure it out. It's, I think, 22 crore 53 lakhs pounds of the time. You can imagine now, if you convert it now, how much, that time there was nothing. Somebody should do this exercise, convert into today's price, um, adding the inflation rates, and you will see that is enormous amount of money that was looted. India helped Britain in its war against America. So when America and Britain has a war, India helped with this many pounds, 38 lakhs, 58,660 pounds that time. The Yale University was formed by money earned by Indian trade. That's Baba Ambedkar gives this very interesting comment in that. Says that whatever money was earned by Mr. L through Indian trade, investing in the East India Company, that profit was pulled into formation of the Yale University. Some very trivial things, but very interesting things. And this is very interesting. So, because India was ruled by the East India Company, the balance sheet of East India Company and the annual budget of India, the budget, they matched. And commercial interest and the political sovereignty, they were forced. And only in 1814, by the Act of Parliament, commercial and revenue returns were separated. Now, you see, for some of you, this must be a very difficult topic. But if you bear a little bit into what I'm presenting to you, it will begin to make a lot of sense to you, and you begin to see the economy in a very different way. And as I said that there's so much in the writings of Baba Ambedkar that we can understand, but how some patients deal with the ideas. If you cannot understand at one go back, listen again, go back to the books that Baba Ambedkar wrote, and it will benefit you so much. Now, the sources of revenue. What were the sources of revenue? Very interesting. The sources of revenue for the East India Company were very different than the sources of revenue for the government today. So the land revenue was like 50%. So the British, the English earned a lot of revenue from the land. And there was, of course, Jamindari settlement of Cornwallis, village land revenue system, Raithwar system, and they earned a lot of 50% of the earnings came from land revenue. And then opium revenue. That time, opium, afu, it yielded so much of wealth. The revenue was so much. Salt revenue, because salt was a very prized commodity of the time. Then customs, both import and export. And that time India was joined to small native states. So you have to pay the custom duty when you travel from, say, Mysore to Bangalore, if there are two different rulers. So you see, that was the land customs was a huge way by which the British earned the profit. And there was, of course, the tobacco monopoly. East India Company had a monopoly over tobacco, abkari kar over the alcohol, wheel tax, because at that time there were no cars. So the wheel tax was charged. If you have buggy or a cart, then the government will charge you some tax. Share duty, the miscellaneous duty, judicial fees, stamp duties, mint revenue, marine revenue, and subsidies from the native states. So the native states who came under the sovereignty of the British, they had to pay the subsidies to the East India Company, and it's huge money. It's huge money. I'm going to show you, some of the statistical data. Now you see, that was the revenue side of the thing. What is the expenditure? So expenditure was charges incident on the collection of revenue, military and naval charges, civil and judicial and police, public works. Baba Ambedkar says that the British didn't do any public work in India. Very little public work. very less canals. He shows with the numbers as to how East India Company didn't resort to the public works. And the roads were not good. They did almost nothing. Interest on the bond debt in India, very interesting. It's a very technical matter. I'm not going to go into that, but it's a very interesting to study this point number 7. Interest on the home bond debt and dividends to proprietor of East India Company, payment on account of Her Majesty's troops, and establishment charges of East India House and Board of Control. So you see, if you look at the expenditure, it was very less on the public work, almost next to nothing on the public work, nothing on the canals, very less on the canals, roads, and all, very less. But the expenses in terms of the home bond debt. Now, the home bond is very interesting concept because the East India Company was raising money in England. The East India Company was raising money in India from the richest in India, from the princes and whatnot. And you see, that was a huge interest to be paid on that, dividends to be to the proprietors of East India Company, very huge. So this was the financial situation during 1792 to 1857. Because 1857, the rule of EIC was done away with, and the crown came to the power. So taking into account the period between 1792 and 1857, Mr. Romesh Chandra Datta says this, that the net financial results of Indian administration was therefore a surplus of 32 millions during 46 years. But this money was not saved in India, nor devoted to irrigation or other works of improvement. It went as a continuous tribute to India to pay dividends to the company's shareholders. And as the flow of money from India was not sufficient to pay the dividends, there was an increasing debt called the public debt of India. So this is public debt of India, Indian debt raised in India, home bond debt raised in England. The year 1857 to 1858 witnessed what is known as the Indian Mutiny and or the War of Independence, raising Indian debt to 66 crores pounds. So the mutiny cost this much to India, and it was paid from the Indian pockets. The money was not brought from outside; it was paid from the Indian pockets. So see, Baba Ambedkar says that the East India Company left Indian industry ruined, agriculture overstocks and overtaxed, and productivity too low. So just to this is the sketch that Baba Ambedkar goes on, and in the next I'm going to discuss about the how the when the power came from the company to the crown, the British Parliament, what happened to Indian economy, and how also the British Parliament found a ways to loot India. That's also what Baba Ambedkar says. So to come to the end, what I'm going to do is we have to understand the lessons in ideas in economics. And I said the economic history as written by Baba Ambedkar and the development of economic ideas. Very interesting because see, 1776, the Wealth of Nation was published. So already the economy as a discipline was not formed. The East India Company came in 1600, and a lot of things were happening. So Adam Smith tried to give it a theoretical shape as to what was happening in the world at time. 1848, Karl Marx Communist Manifesto came, and we will be touching onto it a little bit in the future. And the economy as a discipline was not developed by then. The philosophers dealing with this subject matter were called the worldly philosopher because they dealt with the worldly matters. And in the 1880s, economic studies were included in the colleges in Europe and was known as political economy. The period of worldly philosopher is known as classical period, the period of Adam Smith and Ricardo. People like Alfred Marshall introduced the economic theories. They introduced the calculus, the marginal utility. I'm not going to go into all this technical stuff, but it's very interesting stuff for the students of economy to look into that as to how the mathematical models were developed after the they called it a neoclassical economic theories. Later on, economists like Keynes developed macroeconomics. Very interesting for our point of view because Baba Ambedkar has criticized some of the thinking of Keynes. And Keynes was a big name. Keynes was like a dawn of economics that time. And Baba Ambedkar has gone into even exploring and criticizing his idea. Baba Ambedkar was a very astute mind. He's a very studious person. He read deeply, he studied deeply. So later on, the economists like Keynes developed macroeconomics. The ideas of Dr. Baba Ambedkar matter as they span the entire discipline of economics. Very much matter. His ideas are so important for us. They matter a lot. So you see, Dr. Baba Ambedkar's role in India's development, economic development, welfare. I'm going to show you what he did, how he theoretically founded a lot of things, development, finance, and economic rights of the common man. So, to end today, economy is not, they don't call it a perfect science, they call it a decimal science. Three things matter in economics: ideologies. What kind of an ideology you follow? So we know the capitalism and communism and state socialism. So many ideologies are there. Then the history matters. The history of a country matters. Every situation is a particular situation. You cannot apply a theory with an iron fist in all over the places. So the history matters, and modeling, the mathematical and statistical development in economics. And a lot of scholars argue that they are useful, but they don't capture the total reality of the economics, the dynamics of economy. So I will today leave you with these questions. What was the ideology of Dr. Baba Ambedkar? This is a food for thought for you. Role of history in solving the present day problems, as to how Baba Ambedkar looked at the history as a template to solve the problems of the present day, and how can we take Ambedkar economics further. So these are the questions which we will begin to deal with or dabble with in the coming period. So let me show you how Baba Ambedkar has done his economics thinking, and it's worth looking at. So let me show you. Let me show you. So this is volume number. You see, this is very interesting study, administration and the finance of the East India Company. But I told you this is just a small part of the economic history that Baba Ambedkar was writing about the ancient India, about the medieval India. And I recommend all of you to please go look into that. Very interesting. And it was submitted in 1915. And look at the content of it. Look at the statistical analysis. You see, this is the how the administration of EIC was constituted. Course, court of directors. Very, very useful information. In a single book, you get a lot of knowledge. And you see some of the data that I was mentioning to you, the land revenue. The land revenue, and you see the data. I will show you the Rayatwari system, and the salt tax, and two sources of customs revenue, sea customs and land customs, abkari and the wheel tax. This is the wheel tax. If you have buggies, you have to pay sales duties and judicial fees, stamp fees, the time, and the stamp duties, mint revenue, and this is the land tax. You see the data from 1792 onwards up to 1955-56, and 54% of the entire revenue came from the land. So the land is very important. And opium revenue, you see, 16% of the revenue came from the opium. You can see it's fluctuated from 3% to 16%. Salt tax, of course, 9.5% of the entire revenue. Customs revenue, you see, and this is the expenditure side. You see the expenditure which was on a public works. You see, I was showing you that the canals, how much canals were built, East India and Jamuna Canal, Punjab Canal, truck roads, how many miles, you see, railways, electrical telegrams, and condition of the revenue. The pressure of the revenue, very important term. There was so much pressure on the Indians to pay revenue. They were very pitch poor, but at the same time, they have to pay a lot of revenue. So you see, very interesting. This is data. You see, this is very interesting. The East India Company was following the practices 300 years old of Akbar's ministers, Abul Fazls. They were not at all progressive. Data. This is what Baba Ambedkar has done. Public Indian debt, and this 1858 Act, where when the power was transferred from the company to the crown, And so much. It's a great research. So let me come to the end of it. Just wanted to put to you as to how important is this for you to study. What Baba Ambedkar says here is very important. He says that in 1858, though the British looted India so much, but they came up with the excuses that they will give India rights, rule of law. Of course, they gave the rule of law and there was a peace. But you see what he says, Baba Ambedkar says, but from another point of view, if India's tribute cannot be weighed in the scales of justice and humanity, then England's contribution cannot be weighed in the scale of gold and silver. The last statement is both literally as well as figuratively true. England has added nothing to the stock of gold and silver in India. On the contrary, she has depleted India, the sink of the world. India was called the sink of the world because all the gold and the silver, came to India. Now there is a new book called The Golden Road, which talks about how the India was the land of the gold. Her contribution lies in an uneconomic realm. That's what Baba Ambedkar says, not in the economic realm. But just the same, it is too great to be measured in terms of coin. And this sentence is one of my favorite sentences. But whether mere animal peace is to be preferred to economic destitution, let everyone decide for himself. So what do we prefer? Whether we prefer the peace, which is animal peace, or do we prefer the riches? That's the question that we have to answer. So in this first session, what I wanted to do is to, try to whet your appetite. Try to offer you something which shows how Baba Sahib Ambedkar had this very, very deep study of economics and how he wrote. He's a young Baba Sahib Ambedkar. He's not old. He is not even a popular figure. He's not even into the public domain as yet. But if you look at his study, the kind of the broad, reading he had, the kind of ideas he was churning, the kind of, theories he was thinking through, the kind of love for India he had, isn't it? He is so critical of the British, almost calling them despotic rulers. And you see, this is not an easy thing. India has not realized what Baba Ambedkar did for this country. And, the economist par excellence, nobody teaches him in India. The Department of Economics, they don't teach. They teach sometimes Gandhi, but they don't teach Baba Ambedkar. And you see, that's the great tragedy of this country, the greatest son of India, as I've shown you in this economic history of India. And, so much neglected. And the only thing is the caste system. So, you see, let them neglect, let them, forget. But we are not going to forget. We are going to go back to his books. We are going to look at them. We are going to study them deeply, and we are going to have the strategies for the future. And I think that is one of the things of this course. If we can create a kind of an interest in the ideas of Baba Ambedkar, particularly in the field of economics. And I was stunned. I tell you, in 3 days' time, in our group, more than 650 members, and I'm sure that it's still ringing. So, I think all of us have this responsibility and intellectual responsibility to go back to what Baba Ambedkar has, studied, what he wrote for us, and to really, use that material to train ourselves to think in terms of an engaged economist. So with this, I will end today and I will open it up for any comments or discussion by anybody. We can go on for another half an hour if if some of you wants to comment or anything. So you can open your mic and just talk. Okay. See, economics is not easy to study. It's people are scared, but with this approach, we can begin to take interest. We can begin to know. We can begin to understand. It's a very beautiful approach. I particularly find it very important. I was going to take another approach, technical approach, but I thought it's in the 6 weeks you cannot do much. But I think this way we will begin to see lot of things. Okay.
Good evening, and thanks a lot, Mangesh ji, for giving such a large canvas to think about the economic in Ambedkar's point of view. And what I feel going through this lecture is what we have missed a lot, and we have missed taught about the economics. And we have to view the things in the way that Baba Sahib has seen the India was rich at that time, and how we got into the slavery. And this historical contradiction is also is following this economics. I really very much thankful to you for such a profound lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yes, Vidyanan.
Uh, this is a great lecture, and I was waiting for it since long. Like you made a group for Buddhist economics, then Ambedkar economics. And it's been 2.5 years since then. I was waiting,
I'm
and
sorry for
finally
that.
it has came up. In your presentation, you rightly mentioned that Baba Sahib pointed out that India has not developed economics as a science.
Hmm.
But it's been known that Kautilya's Arthashastra and many other texts which are very popular uh, are the books of economics and seen as the books of economics in the history of Indian economy. So how you see that it's not a science and it's just a book
See,
or some.
actually, Baba Sahib Ambedkar goes into that Vidya, and he says that there is a break in the writings in India, particular Brahminical writings, and he says that when the Buddha came into picture in India, that time the India was already having a lot of intellectual churning, and there were a lot of new ideas. And you see, the Kautilya's Arthashastra is a very doubtful text. It's not, they call it about economy. Nobody knows when was it written, but it's definitely after the Ashoka, definitely after the Buddha. And what he's talking about, in terms of like in China, they had developed certain theories, like people, India also, at the time of, when India was a Buddhist India at that time, India developed a lot in terms of accounting, in terms of developing the banking system, in terms of using zero as a mathematical concept that was found in the Buddhist monastery. So you see, a lot of the things that were not available at the time. And very interestingly, Baba Sahib Ambedkar cites Manu in one of in this one of the writings very early on, saying that it was in the Manusmriti is written that the king will fix the prices. So, I think somebody has to really study as to how much economics there is, how much, manufacturing or artisan, industrial things there. Like, as Baba Ambedkar has shown in the Buddhist Jatakas, there is, of course, a reference of the industrial classes, the artisans, the Kharwans, and we don't find those references in the Brahminical text. Very interesting. It's very interesting. So we have to really think about a lot of things. Right? So I have no idea, whether we qualify the Arthashastra as a science of economics. They call it like Machiavellian concept of statecraft. And of course, I'm not an expert on Arthashastra, so maybe some of you might be able to throw more light on that. Milind?
Yeah. So, what is surprising that such a brilliant economic thought of Dr. Ambedkar
Hmm.
was never known to any of us till recent, only when the writing and speeches were published.
Yes.
Till such time, we were not aware of the economic thought of Dr. Ambedkar. That was kept so secret. I mean, the people here, they did not publish it, or they did not allow others to go through the economic thought of Dr. Ambedkar. So, what we should do, I think we should collectively see that we should focus on publishing this or spreading economic thought of Dr. Ambedkar everywhere. That's what we should do.
Great, Milind, great. Okay.
Hey Mangesh, this is Milind Avsarmol and Nandita Pantavane from New York.
Jai
Jai
Bhim.
Bhim.
Jai Bhim Tai.
Thank you so much for such a erudite and much needed discourse on a very important topics, something which has been ignored out of Baba Sahib's various bodies of work. So we're very excited about this whole series. So thank you again. I don't have any specific comments,
Right.
but I wanted to say thank you. One thing I wanted to add to that was I think the Zoom had a limit of 100 because after 100, I think lot many people were trying to join, but probably the limit did not allow them to.
Right,
So
right. I didn't know that.
maybe for the next session, you can use, I would, if you want to, you can use AIM account, which is a paid account, and it has a much higher limit. So
Right.
that way more people can participate.
Yeah. I paid for this, but I don't know what subscription is that. But let's see. We'll sort it out in the next session.
Yeah. Because, this should reach to more people.
Right.
And definitely, this is a fantastic initiative. Thank you again.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.
Jai Bhim, Mangesh sir.
Jai Bhim Prashant.
Right. So I was looking forward to this session. I have nothing specific technical to speak about,
Right.
but really enjoyed whatever slides you displayed. So can we get these slides?
Yeah,
Because-
I will send you the PowerPoint presentation. I will share in the group, and also this session is recorded, and I'm going to put the recording in the group so that you can have access to all the material.
Sure. Looking forward to the remaining sessions as well, sir.
Yes.
Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim, Basha. So, Mansi,
Yeah.
Hello.
On behalf of Mansi, Professor Mansi,
Yeah.
I'm Dr. Jayant Nandagodi. Would like to
ऐकत
introduce-
कापतो.
Yeah.
Hello.
ऐकत कापतो.
Yeah.
हे बघ, हे simple होतं.
Yeah.
Yes. Please go on.
Oh, okay. On behalf of Professor Mansi Nandagoli, I would like to take this opportunity to interact with because I'm enjoying your session, sir. It was very fantastic and informative. One more thing that by when we are talking about the economic contribution of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, the most important thing that the way Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar put economics to solve the problems before him, especially the most contribution that we should acknowledge. The first Babasaheb would be the first person who started thinking the economics of the caste systems. Prior to Babasaheb, I don't think anybody have think about this economics, and economics implies in the caste systems.
Right.
So for that point of view, also I think the entire discussions will go in that direction also. Try to understand what are the economics and what are the financial interests are involved in the caste systems also. So altogether, it was a wonderful and fantastic session, sir. I would love to join this session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. So I think what we will do, because this is just the beginning, and I actually planned 6 sessions, and I would encourage most of you, if you can prepare and also present in the future, because this churning should take place. People should talk, discuss. The more they exchange ideas, because I see there are PhD scholars in the groups also who had done PhD in economics, and as I said that overwhelming response from all over the places, and it shows that people are interested in this topic, and I think it's a very important topic just to get an idea as to how Baba Sahib Ambedkar encourage us to love money, and how earning love for money is not abstract. This is such a profound idea, and I think our community time has come for the community now to really look live the life of riches, get away from the poverty mentality, never ennoble poverty. but think in terms of the riches, think in terms of the abundance, think in terms of the wealth, think in terms of the prosperity, think in terms of the overall development. So I think very interesting points that we can begin to see in Baba Sahib's economic writings. Okay. So if there is nothing at the moment, we will end the session. And thank you all for joining in. It's not easy to, keep your attention for a long time, in this period of human history. And economics is, can be a very boring topic, but we will try to make it more interesting and we'll carry forth. So thank you on. Thank you so much, all of you, and see you next Friday.
Yeah. Thank you, Mangesh.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.